The fluorescent lights in First National Bank hummed with the kind of persistence that made Marcus Reid want to take a sledgehammer to the ceiling tiles. He stood before Patricia Aldridge's desk with Lily's small hand tucked into his calloused palm, aware that sawdust still clung to the cuffs of his flannel despite the 3 times he'd brushed them clean in the truck. The loan officer's manicured fingers drummed against a manila folder thick enough to contain every mistake he'd ever made, or at least the financial evidence of them. Aldridge looked up from her computer screen, her expression calibrated somewhere between professional sympathy and institutional skepticism. The kind of face that had delivered bad news often enough to perfect the delivery. "Mr. Reid, I've reviewed your application for the barn restoration project." She paused, adjusted her reading glasses. "Your credit is solid. Work history speaks for itself. But there's a question I need to ask for the underwriting team." Marcus felt Lily's grip tighten. The girl had radar for tension the way some people had perfect pitch. "Are you married? A spouse's income would significantly strengthen your loan application. $70,000 is substantial for a single borrower, even with your track record." The question landed like a stone dropped into still water. Marcus watched the ripples spread across Aldridge's desk calendar, the framed photo of what he assumed were her grown children, the coffee mug that declared Mondays were made for miracles in cheerful cursive that had probably never met a real Monday. "No, ma'am, just me and my daughter." Aldridge's gaze shifted to Lily, softened at the edges. The girl stood straighter as if being seen demanded her best posture. "I see. Single father." The words carried weight that had nothing to do with judgment and everything to do with actuarial tables. "That's admirable, truly. But realistically, Mr. Reid taking on a $70,000 barn restoration alone on a 30-day timeline with only your income as security." Marcus felt the familiar tightening in his jaw, the same physical response that came whenever someone mistook caution for wisdom. "I'm not alone. I have her." He indicated Lily with the slightest tilt of his head. "And I have my word. That's collateral you can't put on paper, but it's worth more than whatever formula you're running in that computer." A small sound escaped Aldridge's throat, something between amusement and disbelief. Her fingers stilled on the folder. "Mr. Reid, banks don't accept promises as, then I'll find someone who does." He was already turning, already calculating which regional credit union might look past the numbers to see the work itself. "Come on, Lily." 3 steps toward the door. 4. Lily matched his stride without question, her backpack bouncing against her shoulders. "Wait." Aldridge's voice cut through the ambient noise of ringing phones and distant conversations. Marcus stopped but didn't turn immediately, giving her time to decide if she really meant it. "Let me see your portfolio. The actual work, not just the financial projections." Marcus pulled his phone from his back pocket, called up the photo gallery he kept updated for exactly these moments, handed it across the desk with the screen unlocked. Aldridge swiped through images of deck installations that looked like furniture kitchen renovations where every cabinet door hung perfectly plumb, a 3-story addition that blended seamlessly with a 1920s craftsman because Marcus had spent 4 weekends hunting down period-appropriate hardware instead of ordering reproduction garbage from a catalog. The silence stretched long enough for Marcus to hear the wall clock tick through 30 seconds. 40. Lily shifted her weight but held her tongue, another skill she'd learned too young. Aldridge set the phone down carefully as if it contained something fragile. "You really build like this? No cutting corners? No good enough for government work?" "Built right or not at all, ma'am, only way I know." Something shifted in Aldridge's expression, a crack in the professional facade wide enough for genuine emotion to leak through. She opened the folder, pulled out a form Marcus didn't recognize, began filling it out with handwriting that belonged to a different generation. "My father was a builder, commercial work mostly. He died on a job site when I was 16, heart attack, not an accident, but still." Her pen moved steadily across the signature line. "He used to say you could tell everything about a man by looking at his corners. If the corners were clean, the rest would follow." She slid the approved loan documents across the desk. "Your corners are clean, Mr. Reid. Loan approved pending standard title search and inspection timeline verification. You'll have funds available within 48 hours. Marcus felt something unknot in his chest, a tension he hadn't fully acknowledged until it released. Beside him, Lily exhaled audibly. "Thank you, ma'am. You won't regret this." "I know I won't. But Mr. Reid—" Aldridge removed her glasses, met his eyes directly. That woman who called about the barn, Sloane Hartley, she sounded desperate when she contacted us about refinancing options. Whatever drove her to that point, it's bigger than architecture. Make sure you're ready for what you're walking into." The warning landed cleanly, no misunderstanding possible. Marcus nodded, once shook her hand with the grip his father had taught him, firm but not crushing long enough to mean it, and guided Lily toward the exit. The September sun hit them like a wall of light after the bank's artificial climate. Marcus squinted against it, located his truck in the parking lot by memory more than sight. "Dad," Lily's voice carried the particular note that meant a serious question was incoming. "Yeah, kiddo. Are you going to marry Ms. Hartley?" Marcus missed a step, recovered before it became a full stumble. The truck's door handle was suddenly the most interesting object in his field of vision. "What? No. Where did that even come from?" Lily climbed into the passenger seat with the ease of long practice, buckled herself in before answering. "You smiled when you talked about her barn at dinner last night. You explained the whole foundation problem to Aunt Eva even though she wasn't listening. You don't explain work stuff unless you care about it." Marcus started the engine, buying time with the ritual of adjusting mirrors and checking blind spots. The radio kicked on mid-song some country ballad about lost chances and second tries. He turned it off. "It's just a job, Lily, a complicated one, but still just work. Mom left because you were always working. Now you're working on something you smile about." Lily pulled her sketchbook from her backpack, flipped to a page covered in careful pencil drawings of timber frame joints. "That's different." The girl was 7 years old and had somehow developed the observational skills of a detective and the emotional intelligence of a therapist. Marcus blamed himself for that, for all the adult conversations she'd overheard during the divorce, all the silences she'd learned to read like text. "You're too smart for your own good, you know that. You always say that when I'm right about something you don't want to talk about." She started shading one of her drawings, tongue pressed against her upper lip in concentration. "It's okay if you like her, Dad. I just want to know so I can be ready." "Ready for what?" "For things to change. Things always change when grown-ups like each other. I want to know if I should start getting used to the idea." Marcus navigated the turn onto Mountain Pass Road, the familiar route up toward Hartley property, unwinding ahead like a promise or a threat depending on how you looked at it. Pine trees crowded the shoulders, their shadows striping the asphalt in patterns that shifted with every curve. "Listen, Lily, I'm going up there to do a job, that's all. Ms. Hartley needs help saving her father's barn before the bank takes it. I have the skills to help. That's where it begins and ends." "Okay," Lily returned to her sketch. "But you still smiled." Marcus had no answer for that, so he drove in silence while his daughter drew perfect dovetail joints, and the mountain road climbed higher into country that smelled like pine sap and old money and the particular loneliness of inherited property too expensive to keep and too meaningful to sell. The barn appeared first as a dark shape against the tree line, then resolved into specifics as the truck crested the final rise. Marcus had seen the structure before briefly during his initial walkthrough 2 weeks ago when he'd come up to tell Sloane Hartley that her project was impossible and he wanted no part of it. He'd left that conversation feeling like he'd kicked a wounded animal, which bothered him more than he cared to examine. Now, with loan approval burning a hole in his mental pocket and Lily's too perceptive observations still echoing, he pulled into the gravel clearing and killed the engine. The barn stood exactly as he remembered, a monument to deferred maintenance and the slow violence of weather. The roof sagged like a broken promise. Gray siding showed streaks of water damage black enough to photograph. The main doors hung at angles that would have been comedic if they weren't structural evidence of failure. But underneath the decay, Marcus could see the bones. Hand-hewn timbers from an era when old-growth lumber was standard rather than luxury. Post and beam construction that had held for 70 years despite neglect. Someone with real skill had built this barn, someone who understood that foundations mattered and corners told stories. Sloane emerged from around the far side of the building before he'd fully processed the truck door opening. She wore jeans with actual dirt on them, not the designer distressed kind, and a canvas work jacket that had seen better decades. Her hair was pulled back in a ponytail that had given up trying to be neat sometime around mid-morning. Sawdust clung to her sleeves. "You came back." The words held surprise but not hope, as if she'd trained herself not to expect the latter. "Brought someone with me." Marcus indicated Lily, who'd already unbuckled and opened her door. "Lily, this is Ms. Hartley. Ms. Hartley, my daughter Lily." Just Sloane, please." She crouched to Lily's eye level with the unself-conscious ease of someone who actually liked kids, rather than someone performing the social ritual of pretending to. "I've heard a lot about you. Your dad says you're basically running the household while he's out building things." Lily shook her head seriously. "We run it together. Dad cooks, I clean. He does laundry, I fold. Fair trade. Sounds like a good system. It works for us." Lily glanced up at Marcus with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Can I look at the barn?" Marcus started to object on general safety principles, but Sloane was already nodding. "The main floor is stable. Just don't go near the loft or touch anything that looks rotten. And if you hear creaking, that's not you. Get outside immediately." Lily headed toward the open barn doors with the focused purpose of someone on a mission. Marcus watched her disappear into the dim interior, counted to 5, heard nothing, collapse. "She'll be fine." Sloane straightened brushed sawdust from her knees. "The dangerous parts are all clearly marked with caution tape. I spent yesterday making the space as kid-safe as possible just in case." "Just in case of what?" "In case you said yes. I figured if you were bringing family to the site, you were at least considering it." Marcus pulled his work gloves from his back pocket, the leather so broken in they'd molded to his hands over 3 years of daily use. The gesture was automatic, a tell he recognized too late. "Bank approved the loan this morning. 70,000 48-hour disbursement pending standard verification. Which means if we're doing this, we need to start now. Today. Because 30 days isn't a timeline, it's a deadline with teeth." Sloane's face did something complicated, relief and fear competing for dominance. She looked past him toward the barn, toward the weight of her father's legacy and her own failure to prevent its decay. "I know what I'm asking is impossible. I've run the numbers 100 times. 4 months minimum with a full crew, that's what every other contractor told me before they stopped returning my calls. You're the only one who even bothered to explain why it can't be done instead of just ghosting me." "It can't be done the traditional way." Marcus moved toward the barn, his boots crunching on gravel that needed regrading. "But traditional assumes we're trying to restore everything to original condition, preserve every beam, rebuild every system to modern code while maintaining period aesthetics. That's a museum project. This isn't a museum." He stopped at the barn entrance, ran his hand along the doorframe where wood met stone foundation. The timber was solid despite appearances, the grain tight and dense in a way modern lumber couldn't match. "Your father built this barn. Really built it with skills most contractors today don't possess because they don't need to. CNC machines and prefab components made traditional joinery obsolete except for hobbyists and historical societies. But your father was the real thing. Hand-cut joists, timber frame construction, every beam positioned for maximum load distribution with minimum material waste." Marcus pulled out his phone, opened the photos he'd taken during his first survey. Showed Sloane the images of beam connections the way her father had used, through tenons and wooden pegs instead of metal fasteners, creating joints that could flex with temperature and humidity without compromising structural integrity. If we respect what he built instead of trying to replicate it, if we use modern materials to support the original structure rather than replace it, if we triage ruthlessly and focus only on what's necessary for code compliance and weather protection, then maybe we can finish before the bank forecloses." Sloane studied the photos with an architect's eye, zooming in on details Marcus had highlighted. Her breathing had changed shallow and quick, like someone approaching a cliff edge. "You're saying we save the bones and rebuild the skin. I'm saying we acknowledge what your father knew, and we don't, that this barn was designed to stand for a century with minimal intervention, and our job isn't to improve his work, but to remove the obstacles preventing it from doing what it was always meant to do." She handed the phone back, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. Her hands were calloused in places that suggested she'd been doing more than architectural drafting lately. "When do we start?" "Already started. Thinking is half the work." Marcus pocketed his phone. "But the physical part begins tomorrow at dawn. I need tonight to finalize the materials list and coordinate delivery schedules. You need tonight to decide if you're really ready for what happens next." "What happens next?" "We take sledgehammers to everything that's hiding the real problems. Demo reveals truth, and truth is usually uglier than people expect. If you're going to change your mind, do it before we start breaking things." Sloane's laugh came out sharp and bitter. "Mr. Reid Marcus, I'm an architect who lost her license because a building I designed developed stress fractures in the facade. I know exactly what it looks like when truth gets ugly. The question isn't whether I can handle it. The question is whether you can handle working with someone whose professional judgment already failed once in a way that could have killed people if the cracks had propagated 6 inches further. The confession landed between them like thrown pottery, all sharp edges and irreparable damage. Marcus recognized the weight of it, the particular flavor of guilt that came from mistakes that almost mattered in the worst possible way. Did anyone get hurt? No. Building was evacuated as soon as the cracks were discovered. Independent engineers determined it was a design flaw in how I'd distributed lateral loads across the curtain wall system. My calculations were wrong. Not by much, but in structural engineering, close doesn't count. And your license? Suspended pending review, which is architect speak for career death. No firm will touch me while I'm under investigation, and by the time the review board finishes, everyone will have moved on to the next scandal except the insurance companies who'll remember forever. Marcus absorbed this, recalibrated his mental model of who Sloane Hartley was and why she'd come back to a mountain town she'd presumably left for bigger opportunities. Failure had a particular gravitational pull, the way it brought people back to places they'd escaped. So you came home to save your father's barn because you couldn't save your own career. That's reductive but accurate. Sloane crossed her arms, defensive posture in full effect. Does it change anything about whether you'll take the job? Marcus looked past her at the barn, at the structure her father had built with hands that knew what Marcus's hands knew, that wood had grain and concrete had memory and steel had limits, and respecting those truths was the only path to building something that lasted. It means you understand what's at stake when calculations are wrong. That's useful. Most clients think construction is like cooking, that you can substitute ingredients and adjust on the fly. But you know it's more like surgery. Once you cut, you better be right about where the important parts are. So that's a yes. That's a yes with conditions. $80 an hour, materials billed separately at cost, plus 10% for procurement overhead. Sundays are non-negotiable family days. If I say stop, we stop, no arguments, no second guessing. And if we hit something that compromises safety or code compliance beyond repair, we walk away and let the bank have it. Sloane extended her hand. Marcus shook it, felt the calluses that matched his own, the grip that didn't try to prove anything but didn't apologize either. Deal. When do I get the materials list? Tomorrow morning, 6 a.m. Bring coffee and whatever tools you already own. We'll see what's salvageable and what needs replacing. A crash echoed from inside the barn, followed immediately by Lily's voice. I'm okay. Nothing broke. Marcus was moving before conscious thought caught up Sloane half a step behind. They found Lily standing beside a pile of old lumber that had clearly been stacked against a wall before gravity and 7-year-old curiosity had other ideas. The girl looked up at them with the particular expression of someone who knew they'd messed up, but was trying to determine if honesty or deflection was the better play. I was trying to see what was underneath the tarp. I barely touched it. Marcus surveyed the damage with professional efficiency. The lumber was rotten through, had probably been unstable before Lily's intervention. No harm done except to his blood pressure. This is why we don't touch things in construction sites without asking first. See how the wood just crumbled? That means it's compromised. Could have had rusty nails, could have had wasps nesting in it, could have been supporting something heavier that would have come down on your head. Sorry, Dad. Lily picked at a splinter on her thumb, not quite meeting his eyes. I just wanted to help. Helping means following safety protocols, which we haven't taught you yet because this is your first time on an active site. Marcus crouched beside the debris, picked up a piece of wood that disintegrated in his hand like wet cardboard. But since you're here, let me show you what to look for. He spent the next 10 minutes giving Lily an impromptu lesson in identifying structural rot, pointing out the difference between surface damage and deep compromise, explaining why some wood could be saved with treatment while other pieces were beyond redemption. Sloane watched from a few feet away, occasionally adding observations from an architectural perspective that dovetailed surprisingly well with Marcus's practical knowledge. By the time they finished, Lily had filled 2 pages of her sketchbook with notes and diagrams, her earlier transgression apparently forgiven through education. Marcus stood, brushed sawdust from his knees, and found Sloane looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite parse. What? Nothing. Just, you're good with her. Patient. My father used to say patience was the difference between craftsmen and contractors. Your father was right about a lot of things based on what I'm seeing here. Marcus gestured at the barn's interior, the exposed beamwork visible now that they were inside. This structure was designed by someone who understood wood the way most people understand language. Every joint tells a story about load and stress and seasonal movement. Sloane moved to the nearest support post, ran her hand along timbers that showed the distinctive marks of hand tools, adze scars and chisel cuts that no modern equipment replicated. He built this the summer before I was born. Took him 2 years of weekends and evenings. My mother used to bring him dinner out here because he'd forget to come inside. She said he was more married to the barn than to her some days. The pain in her voice was old enough to have scarred over but fresh enough to bleed if pressed. Marcus recognized it had carried similar weight himself through the divorce, through Emma's accusations that he loved 2x4s more than he loved his own wife. Building takes time. People who don't build professionally never understand how completely it can consume you. It's not like other work where you can stop thinking about it when you leave the site. The problems follow you home, live in your head while you're trying to sleep, hijack your brain during conversations about completely unrelated topics. Is that why your wife left? The question was blunt enough to be rude if it wasn't also clearly genuine curiosity. Marcus appreciated the directness even as he felt the familiar clench of old wounds. Part of it. Emma said I was emotionally unavailable, that I'd rather solve structural problems than relationship ones because buildings made sense and people didn't. She wasn't completely wrong, but not completely right either. No, I think she wanted someone who needed her in a way I didn't know how to need anyone. And I wanted someone who understood that my work wasn't competition for my attention, it was expression of who I am. We were both looking for different versions of the same person, and eventually we had to admit neither of us was it. Lily had wandered over to Warren Hartley's old workbench, the massive piece of furniture Marcus had noticed during his first survey. She ran her fingers along the surface with the reverence usually reserved for museum exhibits. Did Ms. Hartley's dad make this? Sloane joined her, something complicated happening in her expression as she looked at the bench her father had built. When he was 23, before he had a real workshop, he told me once that this bench taught him everything he needed to know about patience and precision, that if you build the foundation right, everything else follows. Marcus moved closer, examined the joinery with professional interest. Dovetails cut so precisely they seemed to grow from the wood rather than being imposed upon it. A tool tray with perfectly fitted dividers. Drawer faces that still aligned despite decades of humidity changes and temperature swings. This is museum quality work. Your father could have made a living building custom furniture if he'd wanted. Why didn't he? He said custom furniture was for rich people who wanted to impress other rich people. Building barns and workshops meant helping people make things which mattered more than making pretty objects for people who already had everything. Marcus heard his own father's voice in that philosophy, the working-class suspicion of luxury divorced from utility. He pulled out his phone, photographed the workbench from multiple angles. We should protect this during construction, move it somewhere climate-controlled until we're done with the rough work. Quality like this deserves preservation. My apartment in town is too small. I've been living in a trailer on site to save money and time on the commute. Marcus looked up from his phone, surprised. You're camping here and September night temperatures are already dropping below 40. Trailer has a heater. And I'm not camping, I'm being practical. 30 days means every hour counts. Spending 90 minutes daily on the round trip to town would cost us 45 hours total. That's almost 2 full workdays lost to windshield time. The logic was sound, even if the execution made Marcus want to lecture her about safety and isolation and all the things that could go wrong when living alone on rural property. He swallowed the impulse, recognized it for what it was. Paternal instinct misdirected at a woman fully capable of making her own risk assessments. The workbench can stay if we tarp it properly and build a temporary frame to protect it from construction debris. But first priority tomorrow is demo. We need to expose the real structure before we can save it. I've been taking sledgehammer practice runs at the loft floor. Figured I should know what I'm doing before you got here. And it's harder than it looks. Also more satisfying. There's something therapeutic about controlled destruction. Marcus smiled despite himself, recognized the particular joy that came from breaking things that needed breaking. Demo is where most people realize construction isn't romantic. It's dusty and exhausting and reveals problems you didn't know existed. We'll start with the loft floor since it's already compromised, then foundation inspection, then framing assessment. Each phase builds on what we learned from the previous one. Lily had climbed onto Warren's workbench despite Marcus's earlier lecture about not touching things, was now sitting cross-legged on the surface like it was a throne designed for small monarchs. "Dad, can I come back tomorrow to help with the demo?" "School, kiddo, non-negotiable. But it's Saturday tomorrow." Marcus ran through his mental calendar, realized she was right. The week had blurred together somewhere between loan applications and sleepless nights calculating material costs. "Still no. This is a construction site, not a playground. Too many ways for you to get hurt. I wear a helmet when I ride my bike. I could wear one here." "Lily, she can come." Both Marcus and Lily turned to stare at Sloane, who looked mildly surprised by her own intervention. "I mean, if you're okay with it, Marcus. I was thinking of setting up a small workspace away from the demo area, somewhere she could do homework or draw while staying safe. Kids learn by watching, and she clearly has an interest in this kind of work." Marcus felt himself being tag-teamed and resented how effectively it was working. Lily's expression had shifted from hopeful to strategically neutral, the face she made when she wanted something badly enough to hide how badly she wanted it. "If, and this is a big if, you come tomorrow, you follow every safety rule without question. Hard hat, safety glasses, steel-toed boots if we can find your size. You stay in designated safe zones, and the second I or Sloane say it's time to leave, we leave. No arguments, no negotiation. Deal." Lily was already mentally planning her outfit. Marcus could see it in her eyes. They spent another 30 minutes walking the property while Marcus pointed out potential hazards, and Sloane took notes on her phone. The sun had started its descent behind the western ridge line, painting the barn in amber light that temporarily disguised its decay. By the time they returned to the truck, Lily was yawning, and Marcus's back was reminding him he'd spent too many hours that week bent over blueprints. Sloane walked them to the vehicle, hands shoved deep in her jacket pockets. 6 a.m. tomorrow. Coffee and tools. Anything else? Bring your father's journal if you're comfortable with it getting dirty. His notes about previous repairs will save us time on diagnosis. And Sloane, get some sleep tonight. Tomorrow's going to hurt in ways you're not expecting." She laughed, the sound tired but genuine. "Architect school, remember, I've pulled more all-nighters than most truck drivers. I'll survive." Marcus didn't argue, just climbed into the truck and waited for Lily to buckle before starting the engine. In the rearview mirror, he watched Sloane stand in the gravel clearing until they rounded the first curve and trees blocked his view. Something about her posture suggested she'd stay there longer, watching the space where they'd been like it might reveal something important. The drive down the mountain passed in comfortable silence. Lily had pulled out her sketchbook again, was adding details to her earlier drawings by the fading daylight. Marcus let his mind work through tomorrow's task list, mentally organizing the demo sequence for maximum efficiency and minimum dust inhalation. "Dad?" Lily's voice pulled him back to the present. "Yeah. Are you going to marry Ms. Hartley?" The question hit harder the second time, maybe because now he'd spent 3 hours on her property, seeing how she moved through space, how she talked about her father's work, how she'd offered to set up a safe workspace for a 7-year-old she'd met once. "Why do you keep asking that?" "Because you only explained the barn stuff for like 20 minutes, but you seemed like you could have talked for 2 hours. And you smiled when she said her dad believed in patience. You don't smile at work stories unless they matter." Marcus turned onto Highway 9, accelerated into the merge lane while composing an answer that was both honest and appropriate for a second grader. Sometimes people connect over shared understanding. Sloane's father built things the way Grandpa did, with care and skill and respect for materials. Meeting someone who understands that matters because it's rare. But that doesn't mean I'm going to marry her, Lily. That means I respect her enough to do good work for her. "Okay." Lily returned to her drawing, "but you still smiled." No argument there. Marcus drove the rest of the way home with his daughter's 2 accurate observations sitting in his chest like a stone he couldn't swallow and couldn't spit out. The kind of weight that meant something even if he wasn't ready to examine what. Dinner was leftover spaghetti, reheated in the microwave because neither of them had energy for real cooking. They ate at the kitchen table Marcus had built the first week after Emma left, when he'd needed to create something stable and permanent to prove that not everything in his life was falling apart. Lily finished first, took her plate to the sink without being asked, loaded it into the dishwasher with the precision of long habit. "I'm going to work on my book report before bed. Need help? It's about a kid who builds a time machine out of recycled parts. I think I got it covered." She disappeared upstairs, leaving Marcus alone with his own plate and thoughts that kept circling back to Sloane Hartley's hands on her father's workbench, the way she'd talked about failure like it was a language she'd learned fluently. His phone buzzed. Text from an unknown number that resolved into Sloane's contact info when he opened the message. Found Dad's journal. Has notes about foundation settling he tracked for 3 years. Also found his original building plans. Thought you might want to see them before we start demo. Marcus typed back, bring everything tomorrow. The more we know about his original intent, the better we can honor it. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, reappeared. Finally, thank you for saying yes. I know it's insane. Marcus stared at the screen, aware that his response mattered more than simple logistics. Insane is just another word for difficult until you figure out the right approach. See you at dawn. He set the phone down, carried his plate to the sink, washed dishes while his mind worked through timber calculations and load distributions and the particular challenge of saving something someone else built when you could only guess at their reasoning. Upstairs, water ran in the bathroom as Lily brushed her teeth. Marcus dried his hands, climbed the stairs, found his daughter already in pajamas and heading for bed. He tucked her in with the familiar ritual sheet blanket, favorite stuffed rabbit positioned just so. Night, kiddo. Love you. Love you too. She paused, studying his face with uncomfortable intensity. Dad, when you were explaining the barn stuff to Ms. Hartley, you looked happy. Like really happy, not just okay happy. I don't see that a lot. Marcus sat on the edge of her bed, the mattress dipping under his weight. That's because I love what I do. Building things, solving problems, making structures work the way they're supposed to. It's what I'm good at, and doing work that matters makes me happy. That's all you're seeing. Is it though? Lily pulled her rabbit closer. Mom left because you only looked happy when you were working. I don't want you to only be happy when you're working. I want you to be happy other times too. The observation carried weight beyond her years, the kind of insight that came from watching a marriage dissolve and drawing conclusions about cause and effect. I'm happy with you, Lily. Every day, even the hard ones. You know that, right? I know. But that's different. That's Dad happy. I mean the kind of happy where you forget to be worried for a minute. The kind where you laugh at something that's not even that funny because your brain isn't thinking about all the things that could go wrong. Marcus felt something crack in his chest, a fissure in the careful emotional architecture he'd constructed over 3 years of single parenting. His daughter had just described a kind of joy he'd forgotten was possible, the kind that existed before responsibility calcified into constant vigilance. I'll work on it. No promises, but I'll try. That's all I want. Lily yawned, already half asleep. Night, Dad. He turned off her light, left the door cracked open the way she preferred, stood in the hallway while his breathing steadied. Downstairs, his drafting table waited in the corner of the living room that functioned as his home office. He descended, pulled out fresh paper, began sketching the barn's structural system as he remembered it. The work consumed him the way it always did, hours passing in what felt like minutes as he calculated load paths and sketched reinforcement strategies. By the time he looked up, his neck ached, and the wall clock showed midnight. He should sleep. 6 a.m. would arrive with its usual indifference to whether he was rested. But first he walked to his workshop, the converted garage where he kept his personal tools separate from work equipment. Found the wooden box where he stored his father's old hand planes, opened it carefully. The tools inside were pristine despite their age, maintained with religious regularity, because his father had taught him that respect for tools was respect for craft. Marcus pulled out the smoothing plane, felt its familiar weight, ran his thumb along the blade edge that could still draw blood if you weren't careful. His father had been using this plane the day before the accident, had handed it to Marcus with instructions to sharpen it properly, make sure the iron sat flush in the mouth with no gaps. Marcus had sharpened it the day after the funeral, tested it on scrap pine until shavings came away thin as paper, had kept it sharp ever since, even though he rarely used hand planes anymore in an age of power sanders and CNC routers. Tomorrow he'd bring it to the barn, use it to true up some of Warren Hartley's original timbers, connect his father's craft to another man's legacy through the simple act of shaving wood. The gesture meant nothing practical, but everything symbolically. He returned the plane to its box, closed the lid, gently went to bed with his alarm set and his mind still running calculations. Sleep came eventually, dreamless and insufficient, And then 6 a.m. was arriving exactly as predicted, with the alarm's cheerful insistence that night was over and work demanded attention. Marcus showered, dressed in his usual uniform of work jeans and flannel-made coffee strong enough to function as moral support. Found Lily already awake and eating cereal at the kitchen table, dressed in play clothes with her backpack ready beside her chair. "You set your own alarm." "I'm coming, remember, gotta be ready." Marcus poured coffee into his travel mug, added cream, with the precise amount only possible after 3 years of identical morning routine. "We need to stop at the hardware store first. Get you proper safety equipment. This isn't negotiable." Lily nodded seriously, finished her cereal, loaded her bowl into the dishwasher. They drove through town in pre-dawn darkness, the only traffic a delivery truck and 2 early shift workers heading toward the lumber mill. The hardware store didn't open until 7, but Marcus knew the owner well enough to call ahead. "Tom, it's Marcus Reid. I know you're not open yet, but I need a favor." 20 minutes later, they walked out with a youth-sized hard hat, safety glasses that actually fit Lily's face, and work gloves small enough for her hands. Marcus added a first aid kit and extra dust masks to the pile, paid with cash because his credit card was already too close to its limit, drove up the mountain road while dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold. Sloane's trailer was exactly where she'd described it, parked beside the barn, with generator cables running to the structure. Lights glowed in the windows, warm and domestic against the morning chill. Marcus parked beside her ancient Volvo, killed the engine, sat for a moment, gathering himself. "You ready for this, kiddo?" Lily adjusted her new hard hat, testing the fit. "Built ready, Dad. Let's go make things right." They climbed out together, and the barn stood before them like a question waiting for answer. Warren Hartley's legacy and Sloane's last chance and Marcus's professional reputation all hanging in the balance of what happened next. Sloane met them at the barn entrance with 3 thermoses, and the kind of weariness that suggested sleep had been theoretical rather than actual. Her hair was still wet from a shower, pulled back in a braid that would survive the day's abuse better than yesterday's ponytail. She handed Marcus the largest thermos without preamble. "Black, no sugar. Lily gets hot chocolate because coffee stunts growth, and I'm not answering to angry parents before 7 a.m. Lily accepted her thermos with both hands, already charmed. Marcus took a long pull from his own coffee, tasted something darker and more complex than the drip machine garbage he made at home. "This is good. Where'd you source it?" "Mail order from a roaster in Portland. My one luxury since moving back. Everything else is ramen and canned soup, but the coffee stays premium." She led them inside, where she'd spent the hours since midnight setting up a workspace that put Marcus's trailer office to shame. Folding tables held blueprints weighted with vintage mason jars. A corkboard displayed Warren's original building plans, annotated in handwriting that matched the journal entries. Work lights on tripods illuminated the space with the cold clarity of operating theater intensity. I couldn't sleep anyway, so I organized everything I could find. Dad kept meticulous records. Every repair, every modification, every time he noticed settling or movement. He tracked this barn like a physician tracks a patient with chronic illness. Marcus moved to the corkboard, studied Warren's notes. The man had documented foundation movement down to the millimeter recording measurements quarterly for 3 years before his diagnosis. The data revealed patterns. Marcus recognized seasonal expansion and contraction, gradual northwest settling consistent with slope drainage, but nothing catastrophic. The structure had been stable despite its appearance. "Your father was dying when he made these last measurements. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer, 6 months from diagnosis to funeral. He spent 3 of those months out here documenting, measuring, planning a restoration he knew he'd never execute." Sloane's voice carried the flat affect of grief processed but not resolved. "The journal's last entry is dated 2 weeks before he died. He wrote instructions for whoever attempted the restoration, assumed it would be a stranger." She pulled a leather-bound notebook from her jacket, handed it to Marcus with the reverence usually reserved for religious texts. The cover was worn smooth from handling the pages thick with sketches and calculations and observations written in fountain pen, because Warren Hartley had apparently believed ballpoints were for people who didn't care about permanence. Marcus opened to the last entry, read words that felt like receiving instructions from a ghost. "If you're reading this, I failed her. Don't let me fail twice. The barn was built to last a century. Give it that chance. Foundation first, always foundation first. Everything else follows. He knew you'd try to save it. Or he hoped I would. Hard to say which. Sloane retrieved her own coffee, wrapped both hands around the thermos like it was the only warm thing in a cold world. I spent 15 years in New York telling myself I'd evolved past small-town nostalgia, that coming home would be regression. Then my building cracked, and suddenly regression was the only forward motion available. Marcus closed the journal, held it carefully. The weight of it exceeded the physical paper and leather, carried the accumulated knowledge of a craftsman who'd understood his mortality and documented accordingly. We'll follow his plan where it makes sense. Modify where modern materials offer advantages he didn't have access to. But the philosophy stays his foundation. First, respect the original structure, build for the next generation rather than the next inspection. Lily had wandered to Warren's workbench, was examining the tool collection with the focus she usually reserved for library books. She pulled out a handsaw with a blade that caught light like water, tested the teeth gently with her thumb. "Ms. Hartley, why are all his saws so sharp? My dad says keeping old tools sharp is harder than buying new ones." "Because my father believed dull tools were disrespectful to the wood. He spent every Sunday morning sharpening and oiling, said it was meditation, the kind where your hands worked and your mind rested." Marcus recognized the practice, had learned it from his own father, who'd held identical beliefs about tool maintenance as spiritual discipline. He set Warren's journal on the cleanest table, pulled his own toolkit from the truck bed, began the ritual of preparation that preceded any serious work. Sloane had assembled her own collection of tools, an architect's instruments mixed with hardware store purchases, so new the price tags were still attached. She caught Marcus's assessment, shrugged defensively. "I know it's inadequate. I'm learning as I go." "Learning is fine. Pretending you know more than you do is what gets people hurt." Marcus handed her a framing hammer, checked its weight distribution. "This is decent. Keep it. But that circular saw is a liability, blades mounted backward. Were you planning to cut or just make noise?" Color rose in Sloane's cheeks as she examined the saw, confirmed the obvious error. She'd assembled the blade backward, a mistake that would have been dangerous if she'd actually attempted to use it. "In my defense, I've been awake for 36 hours and running on spite. Spite's a good motivator, but a terrible teacher. Give it here." Marcus disassembled the saw, reoriented the blade, correctly tightened everything to manufacturer specifications while explaining each step like he was training an apprentice rather than correcting an architect. Sloane watched with the fierce concentration of someone determined not to need the lesson repeated. "How'd you learn all this?" "Your father." "Dad taught fundamentals. Trade school taught theory. 15 years of mistakes taught humility." Marcus handed back the corrected saw. "The mistakes are what matter. Anyone can learn right answers from a manual. Learning why wrong answers fail, that's where skill develops." They spent the next hour sorting through materials already on site, cataloging what was salvageable versus what needed immediate disposal. Sloane had been correct about the loft floor, completely compromised, dangerous to stand on, ready for aggressive demo. But the main floor joists were solid oak, hand-hewn, and still true despite 7 decades of service. "We start with the loft. Tear out everything unsafe, expose the bone structure. Once we can see what we're really working with, we plan the rebuild." Marcus pulled on his work gloves, the leather conforming to his hands like a second skin. "Lily, you're stationed at the workbench. Homework, drawing, whatever keeps you occupied. You don't move from that zone without explicit permission. Clear?" "Clear, Dad." Marcus handed her a whistle on a lanyard. "Emergency signal. You see something dangerous, you blow this. We'll come running. Don't use it unless you mean it, but don't hesitate if you do mean it." Lily hung the whistle around her neck with solemn ceremony, settled herself at Warren's bench with her sketchbook and colored pencils. Marcus watched her arrange her supplies with geometric precision, creating order from chaos, the way he'd taught her, the way his father had taught him. Sloane had already climbed the ladder to the loft level, was examining the floor with professional curiosity and amateur recklessness. Marcus followed her up, tested each rung before committing his weight. "Step only where I step until we map the safe zones. This floor's held for 70 years, but that doesn't mean it'll hold for 70 more seconds. They moved across the loft space in a careful dance, Marcus testing boards, while Sloane marked safe zones with bright orange chalk. The damage was worse up close. Water intrusion had rotted the decking in patches, creating a minefield of weak spots that could give way without warning. But the support beams underneath were Warren's original timbers, still carrying load, still doing their job despite the floor's failure. Your father built redundancy into this structure. The floor can fail without compromising the building's integrity because he distributed weight across multiple load paths. It's over-engineered by modern standards, which means it has safety margins we can exploit during restoration. Marcus pulled his sledgehammer from his belt loop, offered it to Sloane handle first. You get first swing. Your barn, your father, your chance to break something that needs breaking. She took the hammer with both hands, tested its weight. For a moment she just stood there looking at the rotted boards that represented her father's unfinished business and her own failed escape attempt. Then she swung, and the hammer came down with enough force to send splinters flying and boards crashing to the main floor below. The sound echoed through the barn like a starting gun. Marcus joined her, his own hammer finding rhythm opposite hers, and together they demolished the loft floor with the methodical efficiency of surgeons removing dead tissue. Dust filled the air thick enough to taste. Sweat soaked through their shirts despite the morning chill. Below them, Lily remained at her post, sketching the destruction with the detachment of a war correspondent documenting distant battles. 2 hours in, they'd cleared half the loft and exposed the beam structure Warren had built. Marcus called a water break, descended the ladder on legs that reminded him he wasn't 25 anymore. Sloane followed, moving with the stiffness of someone whose body had just learned what manual labor felt like. You're going to be sore tomorrow in muscles you forgot existed. I'm sore now in muscles I never knew existed. Sloane accepted the water bottle Marcus offered, drank half of it in one continuous swallow. How do you do this every day without collapsing? Practice and stubbornness in equal measure. Your body adapts if you don't quit when it starts complaining. They sat on overturned buckets while their breathing steadied and dust settled. Lily brought them granola bars from her backpack, appointed herself unofficial nutrition supervisor. Marcus ate mechanically, his mind already working through the afternoon's task list. Finish loft demo. Begin foundation. Inspection. Assess the support posts for rot or structural compromise. A truck engine growled up the access road, unfamiliar and intrusive. Marcus stood, moved toward the barn entrance on instinct that had nothing to do with rational threat assessment and everything to do with territorial protection. A county vehicle crested the rise white with official seals and the particular bureaucratic authority that made his jaw tighten automatically. Gerald Hutchkins emerged from the truck carrying a clipboard and wearing khakis so crisp they could have drawn blood. Mid-50s, soft around the middle in a way that suggested desk work rather than field labor, with eyes that assessed the barn's exterior with the clinical detachment of someone calculating liability rather than potential. Mr. Reid, Ms. Hartley, Gerald Hutchkins, County Building Inspector. I'm here for the initial site review you requested when you filed for permits. Marcus hadn't requested an initial review. Initial reviews were optional courtesy inspections that most contractors skipped because they invited scrutiny before work had progressed far enough to demonstrate competence. He glanced at Sloane, saw equal confusion cross her face. We didn't request an initial review, just filed standard permits for foundation reinforcement and roof replacement. Hutchkins consulted his clipboard with theatrical precision. Says here the property owner requested expedited review process with initial site inspection. That would be you, Ms. Hartley. I requested expedited permit processing, not an inspection. There's nothing to inspect yet. We've been on site for 3 hours. Nevertheless, I'm here now, so we might as well proceed. Hutchkins produced a camera from his truck, began photographing the barn's exterior from multiple angles. This structure is listed as built in 1954, which puts it under historic preservation guidelines for county-registered buildings. Were you aware of that designation? Marcus felt cold certainty settle in his gut. Historic preservation guidelines carried requirements that could triple costs and double timelines. More importantly, they gave inspectors broad discretionary authority to reject modifications based on aesthetic rather than structural concerns. The barn's not on the historic register. I checked before filing permits. It was added 3 weeks ago. Emergency designation due to architectural significance and risk of demolition by neglect. Hutchkins circled the building, still photographing. The County Historical Society flagged it after receiving notice of your permit application. They're concerned about inappropriate modifications to a significant example of mid-century agricultural vernacular architecture. Sloane's face had gone pale under her dust coating. She stepped forward, architect's credentials apparently overriding her better judgment about confronting bureaucrats. Who requested the emergency designation that requires a formal petition and public comment period. I've been monitoring the county website daily. There's been no notice of proceedings. Emergency designations bypass standard procedures when structures face imminent threat. As for who requested it, Hutchkins flipped through papers on his clipboard. The petition came from the Mountain Valley Preservation Trust, private organization dedicated to protecting regional architectural heritage. Marcus had never heard of the Mountain Valley Preservation Trust, which meant either they were legitimately obscure or recently invented for this specific purpose. His money was on the latter. What does this designation mean for our timeline? All modifications must now be approved by the Historical Commission in addition to standard building permits. That includes materials choices, construction methods, even paint colors. The commission meets quarterly with next session scheduled for December 3rd. December 3rd was 2 months away. Their bank deadline was 28 days from now. Marcus watched Sloane's expression shift from confusion to comprehension to barely controlled rage. This is obstruction. Someone's trying to run out our clock. Hutchkins' face remained professionally neutral, but something flickered in his eyes. Discomfort or maybe guilt, hard to distinguish. I just enforce codes, ma'am. I don't make them. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to complete my documentation. He spent the next hour examining every accessible surface, measuring setbacks, photographing connection points, taking notes that filled 3 pages with his cramped handwriting. Marcus shadowed him throughout, not speaking, just present enough to make clear that nothing would go undocumented on either side. When Hutchkins finally climbed back in his truck, he paused before starting the engine. Mr. Reid, off the record, you do good work. I've seen your projects around the county. This barn deserves someone like you working on it. Then tell whoever's paying you to back off and let us finish the job. The words came out harsher than Marcus intended, but he was past caring about diplomatic niceties. Hutchkins' expression shuddered completely, professional mask dropping back into place. I don't know what you're implying, but I recommend you focus on meeting compliance requirements rather than inventing conspiracy theories. Good day. The truck disappeared down the access road, trailing dust and implications. Marcus returned to the barn where Sloane sat on the ground with her back against Warren's workbench, looking like someone who'd just watched their last hope drive away. This is Raymond Blackwood. Has to be. He's been trying to buy this property since Dad got sick, sent offers through lawyers every month like clockwork. I kept refusing, and now he's found another way to force the sale. Who's Raymond Blackwood? Developer. Big money, bigger plans. He wants this entire ridge for vacation rental condos, views of the valley close enough to town for convenience, remote enough to feel exclusive. My property is right in the middle of his proposed development zone. Without it, his project doesn't work. Marcus pulled out his phone, searched for Mountain Valley Preservation Trust. The website looked professionally designed, but recently registered domain, created 6 weeks ago, according to the WHOIS data. Board of Directors listed 3 names he didn't recognize, but the registered agent was a law firm Marcus had seen before on development project filings. This preservation trust is a shell, probably Blackwood's lawyers setting up mechanisms to acquire properties through regulatory burden. Make restoration too expensive or time-consuming, wait for owners to give up, swoop in with purchase offers framed as rescue packages. Can they do that? Just invent fake historical significance? If the county plays along, sure. Historical designation is subjective enough to manipulate if you know the right people and grease the right wheels. Marcus pocketed his phone, looked at the barn with fresh eyes. Question is whether Hutchkins is actively corrupt or just following orders he doesn't question. Lily had abandoned her post, was standing close enough to hear everything despite Marcus's preference that she remain insulated from adult complications. She studied Sloane with the unblinking focus she applied to problems requiring solutions. "Ms. Hartley, why don't you just sell the barn to the bad guy? You could buy a new place somewhere else and not have to deal with all this stress." The question held 7-year-old logic, clean, direct, unburdened by sentiment. Sloane smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Because some things aren't about money or convenience, Lily. My father built this barn with his own hands when I was still growing in my mother's belly. Every beam he shaped, every joint he cut it, was him making something that would outlast him. If I let someone tear it down to build condos, I'm saying his work didn't matter. And I can't do that, even if keeping it means I lose everything else." Lily nodded slowly, seemed to accept this as sufficient explanation. She returned to her station, leaving the adults to wrestle with implications she couldn't solve with colored pencils and earnest questions. Marcus checked his watch, 11:30, which meant they'd lost 3 hours to Hutchkins's performance review. The afternoon was already compromised, their timeline bleeding minutes they couldn't afford to lose. "We keep working. Historical designation doesn't change structural requirements. The barn either meets code or it doesn't. We focus on that, build our case in documentation that's unimpeachable. When Blackwood's lawyers try to claim our work violates preservation standards, we'll have evidence that every decision prioritized structural integrity over aesthetics. You think documentation will matter when he owns the inspector? Documentation matters because it creates paper trails that survive individual corruption. Hutchkins might be compromised, but his reports become public record. If we make everything transparent, make every decision defensible, then even a corrupt inspector has to work harder to justify rejection. We make the fraud so obvious that continuing it becomes riskier than backing off." Sloane stood, wiped dust from her jeans with hands that had developed new blisters in the 3 hours since they'd started. "How do you stay calm about this? Someone's actively sabotaging us, and you're talking about documentation like we're filing taxes." Marcus picked up his sledgehammer, felt its familiar weight settle into his grip. "Because anger burns energy we need for work. Blackwood wants us emotional and reactive, making mistakes he can exploit. We disappoint him by staying focused and executing better than he expects. Spite's good motivation, you said that yourself. Let's use it for precision instead of panic." They returned to the loft, resumed demolition with renewed intensity that had less to do with enthusiasm and more to do with channeling frustration into productivity. By 2 p.m. they'd cleared the entire floor, exposing Warren's beam structure in its full glory. The timbers were massive, hand-hewn from trees that had probably been old growth when they were harvested. Adze marks showed where Warren had shaped each piece individually, adapting to the wood's natural grain rather than forcing uniformity. Marcus descended for better perspective, studied the structure from below. What he saw made something shift in his understanding of Warren Hartley's skill level. The man hadn't just built a barn, he'd engineered a masterpiece disguised as agricultural utility. Load distribution was perfect, every beam positioned to channel weight through the structure's strongest points. The posts weren't merely vertical supports, but carefully calculated elements in a three-dimensional puzzle where every piece depended on and supported every other piece. "Your father was exceptional. This isn't contractor work. This is craftsman work at a level most professional builders never achieve." Sloane joined him at ground level, following his gaze upward. He apprenticed under a Norwegian timber framer who'd learned traditional techniques from his grandfather. Dad said modern construction had forgotten that wood was alive, that it moved and breathed and needed room to do both without failing. Everything he built accounted for seasonal expansion, humidity changes, temperature swings. He designed for decades, not just code compliance. "Did he teach you any of this?" "He tried. I was more interested in CAD software and architectural theory. Thought hands-on building was outdated, that real innovation happened in computer models." Sloane's laugh carried self-recrimination. "Then I designed a building whose computer model was perfect and real-world performance was catastrophic." Turns out knowing how things should work theoretically isn't the same as understanding how they actually work. Marcus recognized the wound in her voice, the specific pain that came from professional failure witnessed by peers. He'd watched colleagues make similar mistakes, trusted calculations over intuition, relied on software over experience, and paid for it when reality refused to conform to digital predictions. Theory and practice aren't enemies. They're different languages describing the same truth. Your father spoke practice fluently. You speak theory fluently. Together, those languages build better structures than either one alone. Is that why you agreed to work with me? Because you think I bring theoretical knowledge to complement your practical skills? The question carried weight beyond its surface, meaning some deeper inquiry into whether Marcus saw her as asset or liability. He considered his answer carefully, aware that honesty might hurt, but dishonesty would hurt worse. I agreed because your father deserves to be finished right, and you're the only person who cares enough to fight for that. The fact that you also bring architectural expertise is bonus, not requirement. Heart matters more than credentials when the work gets hard. Sloane turned away, but not before Marcus caught the shine in her eyes that suggested his words had landed somewhere tender. She cleared her throat, blinked rapidly, redirected focus to the immediate tasks. What's next? We've demolished the floor. Do we start rebuilding immediately or move to foundation inspection? Foundation. We can't rebuild the loft until we know the support structure will hold additional load. Your father's journal says he tracked settling for 3 years. Let's verify his measurements confirm nothing's shifted significantly since his last documentation. They spent the remainder of daylight on their hands and knees with laser levels and measuring tapes comparing current foundation positions against Warren's meticulous records. The work was tedious, demanding precision measured in millimeters. But it revealed good news: the foundation had settled exactly as Warren predicted, following patterns he'd mapped with scientific accuracy. No unexpected movement, no catastrophic shifts, just gradual accommodation to terrain and drainage that any well-built structure experienced. Marcus documented everything with photographs, time-stamped and geotagged, building the evidence file that would counter Hutchinson's inevitable objections. By the time they finished, sunset was painting the valley in shades of amber and rose, and Marcus's back was demanding rest with increasing insistence. That's enough for today. We accomplished what we needed despite the interruption. Lily had long since abandoned homework in favor of elaborate chalk drawings on the barn floor, creating what appeared to be a detailed map of an imaginary kingdom complete with castle and dragon. Marcus studied her work while she cleaned up her supplies, impressed, despite himself, by the level of detail she'd achieved. That's really good, kiddo. You thinking about becoming an artist? No. I'm thinking about becoming a builder like you. But builders need to know how to draw plans right, so I'm practicing. The casual certainty in her voice made Marcus's chest tight. He'd never explicitly encouraged her toward his profession, didn't want to impose his path on her choices. But somewhere along the way she'd decided carpentry mattered, had begun preparing herself for a future that involved sawdust and blueprints. Builders definitely need drawing skills. Keep practicing. He helped her pack her backpack while Sloane secured the site for the night, covering exposed timbers with tarps and locking tools in her trailer. They reconvened at the vehicles as the last light faded and mountain cold asserted itself. Same time tomorrow. Marcus shook his head. Tomorrow's Sunday. Family day non-negotiable. We resume Monday at dawn. Disappointment crossed Sloane's face, quickly suppressed, but visible nonetheless. She'd probably planned to work through the weekend, maximize every available hour. The timeline pressure was already affecting decision-making, pushing toward unsustainable pace. Right, of course. Family comes first. Always. Otherwise, what's the point of any of this? Marcus opened his truck door, paused. You should take tomorrow off, too. Rest, recover, let your body heal from today's abuse. We've got 27 days left. Burning out on day 1 helps nobody. I'll think about it. Which meant she would probably spend Sunday working alone and hurting herself in ways she wouldn't admit when they resumed Monday. Marcus recognized the stubbornness because he'd lived it himself, the conviction that rest was weakness and stopping meant failure. Sloane, I'm saying this as your contractor and someone who's made this mistake before. Rest isn't laziness, it's maintenance. Your body is a tool. Dull tools do bad work. Don't dull yourself before the real challenges arrive. She met his eyes, and something passed between them. Understanding or acknowledgement, or maybe just shared exhaustion. Monday at dawn. I'll be rested. The drive home passed in silence. Lily fell asleep against her window before they reached the highway, her new hard hat still perched on her head at an angle that would give her a neck ache if Marcus didn't adjust it. He fixed it gently, one hand on the wheel, then drove through gathering darkness while his mind replayed the day's revelations. Blackwood's interference was the obvious problem, but something about Hutchkins's behavior nagged at Marcus. The inspector had seemed genuinely uncomfortable when Marcus accused him of being bought, had even offered that off-record compliment about Marcus's work quality. Either he was an exceptionally good actor, or he was caught in a situation that conflicted with his professional ethics. Marcus's phone buzzed at a red light. Text from Eva. Heard you started the barn project. Dinner tomorrow. Want to hear how insane you've become? He typed back one-handed. Your place. 6 p.m. I'll bring Lily and stories. Eva's response came immediately. Bring wine too. Stories about mountain property disputes pair well with alcohol. Lily stirred as they pulled into their driveway, woke fully when Marcus killed the engine. She removed her hard hat, carefully examined it for damage like it was precious cargo. Dad, is Ms. Hartley going to lose her barn? Not if I can help it. But what if the bad guy is too powerful? What if he can just make rules that force her to sell? Marcus unbuckled, turned to face his daughter fully. Then we make following those rules more expensive than changing them. Corruption works when it's cheap and easy. We make it expensive and complicated. Force them to work harder for their fraud than we work for our honesty. Eventually, the cost-benefit analysis flips. That sounds really hard. It is. But the hard thing and the right thing are usually the same thing. You taught me that, remember? Lily smiled, pleased to have her own wisdom reflected back at her. They went inside together, Marcus moving on autopilot through the evening routine while his mind continued working the Blackwood problem from multiple angles. Dinner was grilled cheese and tomato soup, comfort food that required minimal effort and tasted like childhood. Lily talked through her day between bites, describing the barn's structure with terminology she'd absorbed through osmosis. Marcus listened with half his attention, while the other half calculated material costs and delivery schedules. After Lily went to bed, Marcus opened his laptop and began researching Raymond Blackwood. The developer had fingerprints on projects throughout the region, mostly luxury subdivisions and vacation rental developments that transformed rural property into revenue-generating assets. His company's website featured glossy renderings of mountain retreats designed for wealthy urbanites seeking authentic experiences that were carefully curated to exclude actual authenticity. Marcus found 3 previous properties where Blackwood had acquired land through similar regulatory pressure tactics. In each case, the original owners had fought initially, then surrendered when legal costs and timeline pressures became unsustainable. Blackwood's pattern was consistent: identify properties with development potential, create bureaucratic obstacles that made retention prohibitively expensive, wait for financial exhaustion, purchase at distressed prices. The strategy was legal in the sense that it didn't technically violate statutes, but it was predatory in every way that mattered. And Marcus now understood he and Sloane weren't just fighting to restore a barn, they were fighting a system designed to extract value from people too tired or too poor to resist. His phone rang. Unknown number, but the area code was local. Marcus answered despite the late hour. Mr. Reid, this is Raymond Blackwood. I hope I'm not calling too late. The voice was smooth, educated, carrying the kind of casual authority that came from never being told no by people who mattered. It's late, but I'm awake. What can I do for you, Mr. Blackwood? I wanted to reach out personally, contractor in spirit, if not practice. I understand you've taken on the Hartley Barn project. That's admirable, but perhaps ill-advised given the regulatory challenges ahead. I'm aware of the challenges. We'll manage. I'm sure you believe that. but consider the practical realities. Historical designation review could take months. Your client faces foreclosure in weeks. Even if you complete the physical restoration on schedule, approval delays will make the work legally meaningless. Marcus leaned back in his desk chair, let silence stretch while he considered responses. Is there a point to this call, Mr. Blackwood? Or are you just sharing observations about regulatory process? The point, Mr. Reid, is that I'm prepared to make you an offer that could solve several problems simultaneously. I'll pay you $50,000 to slow the project timeline, not stop. I wouldn't ask you to compromise your professional integrity, just work at a sustainable pace rather than the breakneck speed this timeline demands. Take Sundays and Saturdays off. Extend each phase by reasonable margins. Let the natural pace of quality work run its course. $50,000. More than Marcus would make from the entire barn project even if everything went perfectly. Enough to replace his truck fix, Lily's teeth, rebuild the college fund he'd been cannibalizing for living expenses. And when the bank forecloses because we missed the deadline by weeks instead of days, I purchase the property from the bank at auction. Ms. Hartley walks away without additional debt. You get paid for work actually completed, plus the bonus I'm offering. Everyone benefits except the bank, which frankly can afford the loss. The pitch was seductive in its reasonableness. Blackwood wasn't asking Marcus to sabotage anything, just to work at human pace instead of superhuman pace. And the money would solve problems that kept Marcus awake at night, would give Lily security he couldn't currently guarantee. Mr. Blackwood, I appreciate the offer, but I'm going to decline. Silence on the other end, then a sigh that sounded genuinely disappointed rather than performatively so. May I ask why $50,000 is substantial compensation for what amounts to simply not killing yourself on an impossible timeline? Because Sloane Hartley is fighting for her father's legacy, and I don't take money to undermine people who are fighting for things that matter. Also because the second I accept your offer, I become someone who sells his integrity for the right price. And once you're someone who sells, the price just keeps dropping until you're cheap enough to buy wholesale. Another pause, longer this time. That's principled but impractical, Mr. Reid. Principles don't pay mortgages. No, but they let you sleep at night without medication. Thanks for the call, Mr. Blackwood. We're done here. Marcus ended the call before Blackwood could respond, blocked the number for good measure. His hands were shaking slightly from adrenaline from having turned down money he desperately needed on principle he could barely afford. He sat in the quiet house and wondered if he'd just made the stupidest decision of his professional life, or the most important one. The question had no immediate answer, would only resolve itself in hindsight after the barn was either saved or lost. Tomorrow was Sunday. Family Day, he'd promised. Lily promised himself, promised the memory of all the Sundays he'd missed during his marriage, because job sites demanded attention that seemed urgent until the marriage ended, and he realized nothing about those jobs had actually mattered more than the family he'd neglected. Marcus closed his laptop, turned off the lights, went to bed, with his phone silenced and his conscience clear even as his bank account whispered accusations about irresponsibility and pride. Sleep came eventually, and with it dreams of barns that stood for centuries and foundations that held, despite everything weight and weather could throw at them. Sunday morning, Marcus woke to Lily already dressed and packing her backpack with the focused efficiency of someone who'd learned early that preparation prevented chaos. 6 days into the barn project, and she'd adapted to the disrupted routine without complaint, had stopped asking when things would return to normal because normal was whatever they made it. We're not going to the barn today, kiddo. Remember, Sundays are family days. I know. I'm packing for Aunt Eva's. She texted last night and said if we cancel dinner, she's driving over here to physically remove us from the house. Marcus poured coffee while his body reminded him that 48 hours of 12-hour workdays had consequences measured in muscle soreness and joint complaints. They'd finished the foundation piers. Friday evening passed Hutchkin's first inspection through documentation so thorough the inspector couldn't fabricate violations without committing obvious fraud. That small victory had bought them breathing room, but Marcus knew better than to mistake a won battle for a won war. The farmers' market was crowded with the usual Sunday morning traffic retirees with time to comparison shop young families making organic vegetables into moral statements, contractors like Marcus buying produce because it was closer than the grocery store and marginally healthier than drive-through breakfast. Mrs. Callahan waved from her stand, handed Lily an apple without charging. Heard the barn passed foundation inspection. Gerald Hutchkins's wife mentioned he came home looking less troubled than usual. Said the work was good enough he couldn't justify failing it even though someone wanted him to. The information confirmed Marcus's suspicion that Hutchkins was more conflicted than corrupt, caught between financial pressure and professional ethics. Worth remembering for later when the inspector inevitably faced harder choices about what violations to invent versus what quality to acknowledge. They bought vegetables and bread, then stopped at the hardware store where Tom Carter was restocking fasteners with the methodical patience of someone who'd been doing it for 40 years. Sloane Hartley was in yesterday, bought lumber for roof trusses and asked about engineered beams versus dimensional timber. I steered her toward engineered, stronger, lighter, faster to install. She's learning fast for someone who spent her career drawing buildings instead of building them. Marcus added the information to his mental construction of who Sloane was becoming through this process. She'd arrived desperate and theoretical, was evolving into someone who understood that drawing and doing required different kinds of knowledge. Eva's house smelled like pot roast when they arrived, the kind of comfort food that required hours of attention she'd invested despite her deadline-driven freelance schedule. Tyler opened the door with his usual easy warmth, pulled Lily into conversation about her latest library book before they'd fully entered. Dinner was pleasant until dessert arrived, and Eva sent Lily to find a movie, then turned to Marcus with the expression that meant interrogation was incoming. "Okay, now that small ears are occupied, what the hell are you thinking? 6 days in and you look like you've aged 6 months. This project is destroying you." "It's construction. Construction is physically demanding. This isn't new information." "Don't deflect. You're working 12-hour days on a timeline that was impossible before the bank accelerated it. You turned down $50,000 from Blackwood because of some misguided principle about integrity. And based on how you talk about Sloane Hartley, you're developing feelings you can't afford to have." Tyler cleared plates with practiced diplomacy, but didn't intervene. He'd learned that Eva's confrontations came from care, even when they felt like attacks. The $50,000 was a bribe to sabotage someone who's fighting for something that matters. Taking it would have made me someone who sells his integrity. Once you're that person, the price just keeps dropping. That's noble and financially irresponsible. You have a daughter who needs stability, not a father who martyrs himself for strangers. Marcus felt anger flash hot and immediate tamped it down before words could escape that couldn't be retrieved. Sloane's not a stranger. She's a client fighting against institutional corruption designed to steal her property. And teaching Lily that you stand up to corruption even when it's expensive, that's worth more than $50,000. Eva softened slightly, recognizing they'd reached the boundary where pushing harder would damage rather than help. "I'm just worried about you. Last time you threw yourself into work this completely, it took months to pull you back from the edge. I don't want to watch that happen again. Last time I was running from pain. This time I'm building towards something. Different motivation, different outcome." The conversation shifted to safer topics after that, but the concern in Eva's eyes stayed visible through dessert and goodbyes. She pulled Marcus aside while Tyler loaded Lily into their truck with promises of returned Tupperware. "Just promise me something. Promise that if this project starts consuming you the way work did during the divorce, you'll recognize it and step back." Marcus made the promise, knowing it might be one he couldn't keep, but also knowing Eva needed to hear it. They drove home through darkness while Lily dozed, and Marcus replayed the conversation, examining his motivations with the same scrutiny he applied to load calculations. Was he developing feelings for Sloane beyond professional respect? Probably. Was he using the barn project as excuse to spend time with her? Possibly. Did any of that change the fundamental rightness of helping someone fight for their father's legacy? Monday morning arrived with the kind of clear cold that promised good working weather. Marcus loaded his truck in pre-dawn darkness, drove up the mountain while his headlights caught deer crossing the road in 2s and 3s. The barn's access road had frozen overnight, required careful navigation around ruts that could trap tires or break axles. Sloane emerged from her trailer, looking like she'd actually slept, carried coffee, and a folder thick with documentation Marcus didn't recognize. Sullivan O'Brien called last night, said he could start electrical rough-in Thursday if we're ready for it. Also sent electrical plans he drafted based on your specifications and the building codes. Wanted me to review them since I'm the architect. She handed Marcus the folder with an expression that mixed professional pride and personal anxiety. The plans inside were detailed. Thorough, showed Sullivan's work far exceeded standard contractor electrical. This was engineered system design with redundancy and future expansion built in. These are exceptional. Sullivan did this level of detail for materials plus 20. Said it was practice for his journeyman exam. Also said if we're going to fight Blackwood, we might as well build something so good it becomes evidence of what's possible when people care about quality over profit. Marcus recognized the philosophy, felt something warm in his chest that had nothing to do with coffee temperature. Then we better make sure the framing is worthy of electrical this good. Today we start the vertical structure. They worked through the morning raising wall frames. Marcus teaching Sloane how to read a level while balancing on a beam 6 feet off the ground. The work required trust, one person stabilizing while the other secured both, depending on the other's competence and attention. By noon, they'd framed the barn's north wall, the structure beginning to look like Warren Hartley's original vision instead of weather-damaged ruins. Connor Walsh arrived around 1, pulled Marcus aside with an expression that suggested information rather than crisis. Jake Thornton connected me with his nephew, who's a county records clerk. Kid did some digging into the Mountain Valley Preservation Trust that filed the historical designation. Turns out the trust was incorporated 6 weeks ago by the same law firm that handles Blackwood's development projects. Board of directors are all dummy names, secretaries and paralegals at the firm who signed paperwork without understanding what they were authorizing. So it's completely fraudulent. Fraudulent, but technically legal. They followed all procedures for creating a nonprofit and filing designation petitions. The fact that it's a shell organization doesn't automatically invalidate their actions unless you can prove coordination with Blackwood's commercial interests. Marcus leaned against his truck bed, working through the implications. Proving coordination meant documentation they didn't have access to, required subpoena power or investigative resources beyond what 3 people working a barn restoration could muster. Can we use this information to challenge the historical designation? Maybe. If you file a formal objection with the County Historical Commission and present evidence that the trust is a shell organization created specifically to obstruct this project, there's a chance they'd remove the designation. But that process takes weeks, and you've got 18 days until foreclosure. 18 days to frame walls, install roof trusses, complete electrical and plumbing rough-in, pass multiple inspections, and survive whatever final obstacles Blackwood had planned. The math was impossible unless everything went perfectly, which construction never did. Then we work with the designation in place and build something so obviously code-compliant that even a corrupt inspector can't justify rejection without exposing the fraud. Connor nodded, headed toward the barn where Sloane was measuring spacing for floor joists. Marcus remained at his truck, pulling out his phone to call Sullivan O'Brien with questions about accelerating the electrical timeline. Sullivan? It's Marcus Reid. I know you said Thursday for rough-in start, but is there any way you could begin Wednesday? We just lost another day to information gathering and we're bleeding time we can't afford. Wednesday's tight, but possible. I'll need your framing complete through the areas where I'm running conduit. Can you guarantee that I'll make it happen, even if it means working through the night? Don't work yourself to death, Reid. Blackwood wins if you collapse from exhaustion before finishing. Marcus ended the call, returned to the barn where Sloane and Connor had the floor joist layout marked and were beginning installation. The work went faster with 3 sets of hands, the rhythm developing naturally as each person found their role in the larger choreography of construction. By sunset, they'd completed the north and east walls, had floor joists positioned for the main level. Progress felt tangible, like they might actually beat the timeline if momentum held and luck stayed neutral. Connor departed with promises to return. Tuesday left Marcus and Sloane standing in the barn watching the last light paint the valley in shades of copper and shadow. "We're going to make it, aren't we?" Sloane's voice carried hope, wrapped in disbelief like someone who'd stopped expecting good outcomes and was learning to trust them again. "If we don't make mistakes and don't hit major obstacles and the weather holds and Hutchkins doesn't find creative violations, then yes, we might actually pull this off." Those are a lot of ifs. Construction is nothing but ifs until you finish and realize you somehow navigated all of them successfully. Sloane turned to face him directly close enough that Marcus could see sawdust caught in her hair and the particular exhaustion that came from physical work pushing past normal limits. "Thank you for not giving up on this. Most people would have taken Blackwood's money or walked away when the timeline got accelerated. You stayed and fought and believed this was possible when I'd stopped believing it." The gratitude in her voice made Marcus uncomfortable, shifted dynamics into territory that felt dangerous despite, or maybe because of how much he wanted to step into it. "I stayed because the work matters and you deserve help, that's all." "Is it though, because I don't think you work this hard for every client? I think you care about this project specifically, and I'd like to know why." Marcus recognized the question as invitation to honesty that would change things between them regardless of how he answered. He could deflect, maintain professional distance, protect himself from the vulnerability that came with admitting feelings, or he could tell the truth and accept whatever consequences followed. "I care because watching you fight for your father's legacy reminded me that some things are worth more than money or convenience. Because you didn't quit when quitting would have been easier. Because somewhere in the process of teaching you about timber framing and foundation work, I started to actually enjoy the teaching instead of just tolerating it." He met her eyes, committed to the honesty he'd started. "And yes, because working with you feels different than working alone. Better different. The kind that makes me remember why I fell in love with building in the first place, before it became just another way to earn money and fill time." Sloane's expression shifted through surprise to something softer, more vulnerable. "I'm not good at this. Relationships, emotional honesty, trusting that people will stay when things get hard. My track record is mostly men who got tired of competing with my career for attention." "I'm not competing with your career. I'm working alongside it. There's a difference." "Is there? Because right now your presence is the only thing keeping my career from being completely destroyed by the building that failed. If we don't finish this barn, if I lose it to foreclosure, I don't just lose my father's legacy. I lose any chance of rebuilding my reputation as an architect who can complete difficult projects." The confession revealed dimensions to Sloane's investment Marcus hadn't fully appreciated. She wasn't just saving a barn, she was saving her professional future, proving to herself and potential future employers that failure didn't define her. "Then we make sure you don't lose it. We finish what your father started, and we do it so well that your resume includes restored historic barn under impossible timeline while fighting institutional corruption. That's not failure, that's the kind of accomplishment that makes people want to hire you." Sloane laughed, the sound carrying equal parts hope and exhaustion. "You make it sound achievable when the math says it's impossible." Math never accounts for stubbornness or spite or the particular satisfaction of proving doubters wrong. We have all three in abundance. She leaned forward, kissed him quickly before pulling back with an expression that suggested she'd surprised herself as much as him. "That was probably inappropriate given you're my contractor and I'm your client and we're both exhausted and not thinking clearly." "Probably." Marcus felt his heart rate elevated, his careful emotional walls developing the kind of structural cracks he'd spent 3 years preventing. "But I'm not complaining." "Good. Because I've wanted to do that since you explained sistering beams like it was poetry instead of carpentry." They stood in the gathering darkness, the barn framing casting long shadows across ground that had been empty ruins a week ago and was now becoming something worth preserving. Marcus knew he should leave, maintain professional boundaries, protect himself from the complications that came with mixing business and personal feelings. Instead, he kissed her properly, took his time with it, communicated through actions. What words made clumsy? She responded with equal intensity, her hands finding his shoulders, his finding her waist, both of them temporarily forgetting that 18 days remained and countless obstacles stood between current moment and successful completion. A truck engine growled up the access road headlights announcing arrival before the vehicle became visible. Marcus and Sloane separated automatic guilt response despite being two adults doing nothing wrong on private property. The truck resolved into Hutchins County vehicle, the inspector emerging with his clipboard and an expression Marcus couldn't read in the dim light. "Mr. Reid, Ms. Hartley, I apologize for the late visit, but I needed to speak with you both off the record." The phrase "off the record" from a government inspector was either very good or catastrophically bad with no middle ground. Marcus moved slightly in front of Sloane, protective instinct overriding rational assessment that she didn't need protecting from conversation. "What can we do for you, Mr. Hutchins?" The inspector looked genuinely uncomfortable, kept glancing at his truck like he was considering retreat. "Raymond Blackwood contacted me this evening, offered me $20,000 to fail your framing inspection when I come out later this week. Said I should find code violations related to load-bearing calculations or fire separation requirements areas subjective enough to justify rejection." Marcus felt cold certainty settle in his gut. $20,000 was substantial money for a county employee, enough to represent serious temptation even for someone with ethical concerns. "And you're telling us this because I'm tired of being the person who helps rich men steal from desperate people. My wife asked me tonight how I could sleep knowing I was being paid to destroy honest work. I realized I couldn't answer her." Hutchins pulled an envelope from his jacket, handed it to Marcus. "This is documentation of every conversation I've had with Blackwood or his representatives. Dates, times, amounts offered, specific instructions about which violations to cite. It's enough to prove pattern of corruption if you want to file charges." Sloane stepped forward, accepted the envelope with hands that shook slightly. "Why now? You could have told us this last week, saved us time and stress." "Because last week I still thought I could take the money and rationalize it as just following orders. Then I inspected your foundation work and realized I was being asked to fail something that met every code requirement. That's not following orders, that's fraud. And I won't be that person anymore regardless of financial cost." The confession carried weight beyond simple information sharing. Hutchins was effectively ending his relationship with Blackwood, probably burning bridges that might lead to lost income from other developers who learned an inspector couldn't be bought. "What do you need from us?" Marcus kept his voice neutral, aware that gratitude might feel condescending given the inspector was only now choosing ethics over profit. "Nothing. Just build it right. Document everything. And when I come for inspections, I'll do my job properly instead of inventing violations. Whatever happens with Blackwood after that is between him and the county ethics board." Hutchins returned to his truck, drove away, leaving Marcus and Sloane holding evidence that could destroy a developer's corruption network if used correctly. They stood in silence while the night settled around them, and the weight of the envelope made itself felt. "We could end Blackwood's entire operation. Take this to the county prosecutor, trigger an investigation that would examine every property acquisition he's made through regulatory manipulation." Sloane spoke with quiet intensity, her architect's mind already working through the implications and branching consequences. "We could. Or we could use it as insurance. Keep it safe. Let Blackwood know we have it. Give him the choice between backing off quietly or facing public exposure." "That sounds like blackmail." "It's leverage. Blackmail would be demanding money. We're demanding he leave us alone to finish the work." Marcus pulled out his phone, photographed every page of Hutchins's documentation, uploaded the images to cloud storage with copies sent to his lawyer and Eva for safekeeping. The original envelope went into Sloane's trailer, safe backup against any attempts to destroy evidence. "Tomorrow morning I call Blackwood. Tell him we have the documentation and we're willing to let it stay private if he withdraws all obstacles. Historical designation, bank pressure, inspector corruption, everything. He gets to keep his reputation if he lets us keep the barn." Sloane nodded, had apparently moved past any moral qualms about using leverage against someone who'd been using it against them. They worked another 2 hours by portable light, finishing the east wall framing before exhaustion made continued work dangerous. Marcus drove down the mountain while his mind rehearsed the conversation he'd have with Blackwood, finding the right balance between threat and negotiation. Tuesday morning, Marcus made the call before his first coffee finished brewing, wanted Blackwood off balance and reactive rather than prepared. "Mr. Blackwood, this is Marcus Reid. We need to talk about your arrangement with Gerald Hutchkins and the Mountain Valley Preservation Trust." Silence on the other end, then a careful response that revealed Blackwood calculating angles. "I don't know what you're referring to." "You offered Inspector Hutchkins $20,000 to fabricate code violations for our framing inspection. You created a shell nonprofit to file false historical designation. You pressured First National Bank to accelerate our foreclosure timeline. I have documentation of all of it, and I'm willing to make it public unless you withdraw every obstacle you've created." More silence, longer this time. When Blackwood spoke again, his voice carried an edge Marcus hadn't heard in their previous conversations. "That sounds like extortion, Mr. Reid." "It's negotiation. Extortion would be demanding money. I'm demanding you stop interfering with a legitimate construction project. Withdraw the historical designation petition. Tell the bank to restore the original foreclosure timeline, and instruct any inspectors you've compromised to perform their jobs ethically. And if I refuse, then I file the documentation with the county prosecutor and let them investigate every property acquisition you've made in the last decade. I'm guessing they'll find enough evidence of regulatory corruption to make you radioactive to future development projects." Marcus could hear Blackwood breathing, could almost feel the man's mind working through options and finding them all unattractive. "You're making a mistake, Mr. Reid. I have resources you can't imagine, lawyers who specialize in destroying people who threaten me. Resources don't matter when the evidence is public record. Sue me if you want. Discovery will be fascinating." He ended the call before Blackwood could respond, felt adrenaline making his hands shake slightly. He'd just threatened a man who played power games professionally, had probably made an enemy who'd find ways to retaliate that couldn't be traced back to their source. But he'd also drawn a line that protected Sloane's barn and his own integrity, had used Blackwood's tactics against him in ways the developer wouldn't have expected from a small-town contractor. The barn work consumed the next 12 days in a blur of 14-hour shifts and precision carpentry that left no room for mistakes. Sullivan O'Brien arrived Wednesday with materials and expertise that transformed rough framing into professional electrical infrastructure. Connor Walsh followed Thursday, his plumbing work complementing the electrical in ways that suggested the two craftsmen had coordinated despite never meeting before this project. The weather held clear and cold, perfect for construction work that required precision. Materials arrived on schedule. Equipment functioned without failure. Every small element that could have derailed them stayed cooperative, like the universe had decided this particular project deserved success. Hutchkins returned day 14 for framing inspection, spent 3 hours examining every connection and measurement with the thoroughness of someone determined to prove competence rather than corruption. He signed off without comment beyond "everything meets code, proceed to roofing." The historical designation mysteriously disappeared from county records day 16. Someone at the Preservation Commission apparently decided the Mountain Valley Preservation Trust lacked standing to file petitions given its shell organization status. The bank called day 17 to inform Sloane her foreclosure timeline had been restored to the original day 28 deadline, offering no explanation for the change. Blackwood had apparently decided public investigation was worse than private defeat, had withdrawn his obstacles, and accepted that this particular property would escape his acquisition plans. Day 24, they installed the final roof shingle, secured the last piece of siding, completed punch list items that transformed rough construction into finished building. The barn stood square and true, every beam properly supported, every system code compliant, every detail honoring Warren Hartley's original vision while incorporating modern materials that would ensure another 70 years of service. Final inspection was scheduled for day 27, giving them 1-day buffer against any last-minute problems. Hutchkins arrived at 8 a.m. with a new assistant Marcus didn't recognize, spent 6 hours examining the barn with forensic thoroughness. At 3 p.m., he signed the final certificate of occupancy, handed it to Sloane with an expression that might have been respect. "This is exceptional work, Ms. Hartley. Your father would be proud." Marcus watched Sloane's face transform, saw her eyes go bright with tears she'd been holding back for weeks. She accepted the certificate with both hands, held it like it was precious cargo that might evaporate if handled roughly. "Thank you, Inspector Hutchins, for everything." After Hutchins drove away, Sloane called the bank from her trailer speakerphone loud enough for Marcus to hear the conversation. "This is Sloane Hartley. I'm calling to confirm my barn restoration received final occupancy certificate today, which per the deed clause triggers my right to refinancing negotiation." The bank officer's voice carried resignation that suggested she'd been expecting this call. "We received the inspection documentation. Our loan committee will review and contact you within 48 hours with refinancing terms. I'll be waiting." Sloane ended the call, turned to Marcus with an expression mixing triumph and disbelief. "We did it. We actually did it. You did it. I just helped you finish what your father started." She crossed the trailer's small space, kissed him with intensity that communicated more than words could about gratitude and attraction and the particular connection that developed between people who'd fought impossible battles together. "Don't minimize your role. You turned down money to protect this project. You found contractors who worked for basically nothing. You threatened a developer with enough power to destroy careers. You built this barn like it was your own father's legacy." Marcus felt the truth in her words, recognized that somewhere in the process of saving Warren Hartley's barn, he'd found something worth fighting for beyond simple paycheck or professional reputation. "What happens now, with us I mean, project's finished. Professional relationship is technically over." Sloane smiled, pulled him closer. "Now you take me to dinner like a normal person instead of a desperate client. Now we figure out what this is when we're not covered in sawdust and racing impossible deadlines. Now we see if the connection we built while building the barn can survive the barn being finished." "I'd like that. But I should warn you, I'm not good at relationships. I work too much. I get consumed by projects. I forget that other people need attention and communication. And I'm a recovering workaholic with trust issues and a failed career I'm trying to rebuild. We're both disasters. Maybe we can be disasters together and somehow make it work." Marcus laughed, despite himself recognized the truth in her assessment. "First, though, I need to make sure Lily's okay with this. She's gotten attached to you over the last month. If things don't work out between us, she's the one who'll be hurt. Then we better make sure things work out." 6 months later, Marcus stood in the barn that had become Sloane's workshop and studio, watched her draft plans for a client who'd hired her based on the barn restoration's reputation. She'd rebuilt her architectural practice one small project at a time, had found that working with contractors who respected craftsmanship was more satisfying than designing trophy buildings for wealthy clients who only cared about aesthetics. Lily sat at Warren Hartley's workbench, now officially hers, sketching furniture designs with the careful precision she'd learned from watching Marcus work. She'd announced last week her intention to become a builder like her father, had started reading carpentry textbooks with the same focus she'd previously reserved for novels. Eva's wedding had happened in October, Marcus standing as best man while Sloane sat in the front row, and Lily served as flower girl with solemn importance. At the reception, Eva had pulled Marcus aside. "You look happy, really happy. Not just okay happy. I haven't seen you like this since before Emma left." "I am happy. Turns out building something with someone who cares about the same things makes the work feel different. Better." "You going to marry her?" The question didn't surprise Marcus. Eva had been asking it weekly since the barn finished. "Eventually, when the time's right, and I'm sure Lily's ready for it." "Lily's been ready since day one. She ships you two harder than anyone." Now standing in Warren's barn, watching Sloane work and Lily draw. Marcus felt the rightness of it settle around him like a well-built structure finding its load-bearing equilibrium. The barn stood because Warren had built the foundation properly. The relationship stood because he and Sloane had built it on honest work and shared values, and the understanding that quality took time whether you were constructing buildings or constructing lives together. His phone buzzed. Text from the bank. Refinancing approved. 5% interest, 10-year term. Congratulations, Ms. Hartley. Marcus showed Sloane the message, watched her face light up with relief that had been 6 months coming. It's really over. The barn is really mine. It was always yours. Now it's just official. Lily looked up from her sketches. Does this mean we get to celebrate because I vote for pizza and a movie night where Dad doesn't check his phone every 5 minutes to see if something's on fire? Marcus laughed, recognized his own anxious habits reflected back through his daughter's observations. Pizza and a movie sounds perfect. No phones, no work talk, just family time. All three of us. Lily's question carried hope, wrapped in careful casualness like she was afraid to assume. Marcus looked at Sloane, saw her nod with an expression that matched Lily's hope. All three of us. They locked up the barn as sunset painted the valley in shades of amber, and Rose drove down the mountain road that Marcus had traveled hundreds of times over the last 6 months. The barn stood behind them in the rearview mirror. Warren Hartley's legacy preserved, Sloane's career rebuilt, Marcus's faith in impossible things restored. Built, right, or not at all. The phrase had started as professional standard, had become personal philosophy applied to barns and relationships and the careful construction of family from people who'd learned through failure that the foundation mattered more than the speed of building. The barn would stand for another 70 years, maybe longer, and Marcus would stand alongside Sloane while they taught Lily that quality took time, whether you measured it in buildings or in love, that the hard thing and the right thing were usually the same thing, and that sometimes the best structures were the ones you built with someone who understood that craftsmanship meant caring enough to do it right, even when doing it right was impossible.